I have, for the last 1.5 years, worked at F-Secure. I'm there on my second commission, that's at least how I say it. So I used to be there also about 10, 12 years ago. So when I went back there, I felt like I was going home. It's an organization where we work in kind of tight teams where testers and developers are in the same teams, and a lot of times things that we need to do are kind of related, for example, on finding new colleagues into our teams. And one of the things that we have actually over years done, already back in the days when I was there previous time, is that when we are recruiting people, we're going to ask them a default question, just kind of like, to assess whether that developer or a tester knows how to approach testing, how to think around testing. And the default question is, how would you test a text field? And this is usually how we frame the question. So you are thinking of, being in a job interview, and it's a tester position, and we are going to ask you to spend time, maybe 10 or a little bit of thinking of it, but just, start answering, how would you test a text field? Has anyone ever done this kind of a question? Have you ever had to answer these kind of questions? How would you test a text field? Some people, okay. So I will show you a text field. Yes, if I can just get this to die out. So we have a text field here. How would you test this? Anyone? Let's imagine we are now in that job interview. How would you test it? Press the button. Buttons, you were saying something? Enter values and press button. There was someone there saying something?
Yeah, I said
try leaving the field blank. So check what the JavaScript analysis tools say. Any other suggestions?
I would ask what is needed.
So why does this application exist in the first place? Kind of answers to that would be nice.
It depends on what was the requirement.
So you would like to see requirements. So if I tell you there's no requirement specification on this, how would you still approach it? You're told you need to test this. What else, if I say there's no requirement specification, what else would you ask? So you want to put emojis, sounds good. Cross-site scripting, so now we're getting to different kinds of contents. Anything else? Inspect the element, so kind of getting closer to the source of it and see what it does. So I'm not going to show you yet what this does, but I'm going to show you first on what's the kind of the typical answer for the interview questions. So back at F-Secure over 10 years ago, when we were asking or started to ask this question, it does show me different things than it shows there. Maybe now. Interestingly, it shows completely different thing than it's supposed to. Let me just fix that. Mirror show. So, when we were asking this question, basically from the people who used to work in the organization already, we got answers from pretty much all around. Types of things that you would actually say just a moment ago when I was asking you with the text field on how would you test that. We categorized them into a couple of levels. The lowest level, we call them people who are either very junior to testing, or they are not actually testers. They maybe want to be testers at some point, but they don't really yet know what they are about to do as a testing role person. So usually typical things is kind of like they would look a text field and they would say kind of like, I can write there some English text, some Finnish text, maybe something that has some special alphabets to a language, but kind of like a couple of basic scenarios, usually more on the positive side, is what they came up with. Kind of like if you try it with one value, it must work. And that was the end of it. And that was actually a very common way of people approaching testing. And still asking around with some developers, looking at how we test APIs with developers, which is basically still filling in text fields, we get these ideas of, if we try it with one value and it worked, it must work with all values. So I still think of that as kind of like not the right level. There would also be people who used to be developers who kind of like framed it as this must be a unit test, kind of like I have this automation and unit test, a single field, and the field is all I have, and there's no context around it, kind of thinking of it in that way. So anything around environments, whether I can run it in different browsers, whether the browser that I just showed you was the only browser that it's supposed to work in, none of that usually comes up. They usually talk a lot about automation. They talk about how quick the computer must be, kind of like processor power, things like that. So whatever comes to their mind, kind of, I'm not always sure if they know how that's connected, but it kind of comes from a checklist. And they would often talk about creating test cases where someone writes the test cases first, kind of like, 20 questions. I write it here, then I wait some time and I give the list of questions to someone else so that I'm most likely not finding or learning anything while doing it because I'm just quickly asking through those questions. So these kind of process ideas. But also there were people in this category who kind of like thought of it as it must be a huge task. So when given a text field, it's probably going to be like 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, a month of work. So there's so much to do. But they couldn't precisely say what all that time would go into. So kind of like having unrealistic expectations to both sides. So we kind of thought of that as not the best level of performance. Then we saw the second level of people who we called testers or quality engineers with a functional testing experience. So clearly these people had done something with testing, but usually it appeared from whatever they came up with and whatever they suggested that all the ideas were functional. So us as a group, nobody actually suggested that there would be anything related to performance. There was a bit of security related stuff with the SQL scripting that was just suggested. But usually kind of like these people, this group of people, don't really think outside what is in the specification, what's the functionality, what is this supposed to be doing, and making sure that it works. This group of people usually has a great idea of all sorts of things that you can, put in there. That it might matter what size of a thing you put inside. Like it could be 0 characters, it could be 10,000 characters. Maybe there's a limit, maybe I can find the limit. And they might have ideas of tools that they can use to generate stuff so that they don't actually have to go and just write a particular number of characters. They would try things like erasing text, different kinds of inputs and usually around processes, then they would talk around kind of like writing a bug report and making it as clear as possible. So kind of like when they then find problems, what they would do about that. So they would kind of jump into that as well. So clearly they had done something and had some ideas on what are things that you get into on a practical level when you're testing a text field. So then the third level that we kind of identified is like this stronger, more brilliant, more excellent functional tester, or what we called kind of like back then like a real senior person. And they would usually kind of be coming up with a lot of different ideas. They also would usually talk about prioritization and risk, because there's not time to do everything, that there might be some kind of a limitation of time that is given to us whenever we're given a text field. And they usually, at some point, talking around this, listing all these different things, they would ask things like, why would anyone want to test this? Like, what's the use case for this? Like what's where is this text field? Like, it usually was just, a picture somewhere. Like, they wouldn't ask whether it was an individual web application like the one that I just showed you, or maybe it was attached to a control panel that controls something in a nuclear power plant and might have a bit more severe impacts. So they usually would come to that a little later. And also they would often talk around kind of like talking to other people, developers, stakeholders, figuring things out. So kind of not given a specification, they would figure out that there are other people that they could go and ask these things from. Then they usually, the kind of the highest level that we then identified as what we were really, really looking for is that they wouldn't actually give you a list of things at all. That this is usually where you recognize a really, really good tester. They wouldn't tell you what kind of things to put into that text field before you would actually give them more context to that question. So they would ask, first thing is, where is this text field? Why would anyone want to use this? And then figuring out things around maybe the technology, maybe around how it's implemented, who's implemented it, has anyone tested it before, and like whatever questions they could come up with. And usually, instead of giving us any of those examples on what you can put into those text fields, they might mention tools like, there's a very nice list of naughty strings that I often like using, which means basically a JSON file with all kinds of different things, including the emojis that somebody mentioned, that you can copy-paste into fields that have provided me over my 25 years in testing hundreds, maybe thousands of bugs with various applications that we actually have fixed. So that is a relevant thing, but it is just a very small part of all the things that we do when we are testing. So this kind of questions around what we do with the text field in interview situations, I came to the conclusion that they might actually not tell us the best thing. So I decided that instead I'm going to be doing, even in interview situations, real applications, little demos, little things that you can actually play with and see how people learn around the application, what kind of questions they ask. So let's start with this one. Let's look for the naughty strings. And since we're in a conference, I have learned over time that I want to find it in GitHub, because I never know which network gives me what kind of contents. So I have here a JSON version, I have a text version, so this is kind of like very easily automatable stuff as well. And if I really actually want to go through this and I have an easy way of determining whether it works or not, I would probably want to automate a lot of this stuff. But right now, it's just a source of great examples of text. So I liked somebody's ideas of emojis, so let's scroll down, see any emojis here. Some of my favorite emojis here. So, what do you think will happen when I copy-paste the emojis here? What will happen?
Emojis will appear.
So, emojis would appear would be a nice thing to have, at least. So, it seems emojis came. So, what should we do next? We copy-pasted emojis. Should we click the OK button? Anyone for the OK button? OK. Does somebody want to put some different text before we press the OK button for the first time? There's somebody who wants to put different text. What do you want to put as a different text? Do you have an idea? So we can take something else from this list. Japanese emoticons, that sounds good, right? So what do you think we'll see when we copy-paste the Japanese emoticons? Hopefully them. Well, seems like we do. Japanese characters don't show up correctly, but these still do. But anyway, it's now time to press the OK button. So we get some text. What did we just learn? What do we know about the application? We've now done 2 tests. What do we know about the application so far? The input doesn't come out. Yeah, that's a good observation. It doesn't show us the input with the output. Again, we are learning this application. We are not given requirements. We are given a text field that we need to test. And there's nothing else on this one.
You also don't know if the input is connected at all to the output so far? You don't know if there is a connection.
So we don't know if there's a connection. So what's the next test that you want to run? Click OK second time. There was some other suggestion there?
Negative test?
A negative, what would be a negative test here?
Test anything, any, like, say, negative numbers or something.
Negative numbers, okay. So trying numbers, that's one thing. You had a suggestion there? Somebody in the back. Sorry?
Already said multiple OKs.
Sorry?
Multiple button presses.
Multiple button presses. So you're kind of on the same side of pressing the button again.
What does the message mean? I think I'd question that before I do anything more.
Again, there is no one to answer the question. We are with this application right now. You don't have any other answers than what the application is giving you. What would be your next test? And all of this is always things that you get to decide. You are in control whenever you're working with whatever application. What is the thing that you would just test next? So I'm asking for your suggestions before I do it.
Remove the input, press OK again.
So not just pressing the button again, but removing the input and then pressing OK.
I would try first the text that is less special than this.
Yeah.
So something normal text. Refresh the page. So we have a lot of good ideas, but there were two people who insisted on saying, let's press the OK button again. So I will press the OK button again. And any of these are great suggestions. But the question we should have in mind when we are actually testing an application is, what does this teach us? So I'll click on the OK button again. What did it teach us?
That there's no fixed relationship between the input and the output.
So that there doesn't at least seem to be any fixed relationship between the input and the output. Anything else? What would be the next test that you run now? What's the next test that would teach you something about this application? Press OK. So kind of like, you don't believe with one, so you want to see it again. Some other input. So we can try, what would be your other input? Do you have like the number, negative number? I can use that. Oh, I pressed enter. It clearly had a bug in it. Enter doesn't do it. So still, it's giving us some kind of pieces of text. There was already a great suggestion earlier that didn't come up again now that when we were actually testing. I think the next test that we probably would want to do is go and see the source. We would like to see what this actually does. And it's not a super complicated application. So very nicely, we have the full source here to just check. The only functionality is with the button, where it then randomly gives us these pieces of text that has been defined. So actually, a lot of times I find that in a developer audience, I get the let's look at the source first. In a tester audience, we get fooled a lot more. And we try, testing all sorts of things. But then again, in a tester audience, we might find things like pressing enter doesn't actually press the button, kind of like I might have imagined. So this particular thing, this particular sample, it doesn't do anything, but based on pressing the button, it generates something randomly out of the existing text. So the reason why I show this kind of as a first example is that a lot of times we get fooled by the applications. This is a only for testing purposes application, but real applications hopefully wouldn't be done to trick us, but they will trick us by accident. So let's look at another application. So I have here a full Java program. So if you feel like reading the code, I think we won't have time. There's way too many lines of code. And when we run the application, there's just one text field that I actually want to test there. So again, if you would want to go back to the code, you would have to go and find a right place in the code, maybe with a breakpoint, maybe with finding some right terminology that you can track so that you could even find where the text box is in this application. But there's this thing called animations that I can edit with this. Oops, sorry. Testing resources. And basically what I just did is just initialize this application so that I have here now a bunch of images that I could basically bring here if I wanted to. Like, for example, I can take a stormtrooper. I could then animate it by creating several cells. But I don't care about that functionality. We are still on how would you test this? How would you test a text box? So I have here a text box. It actually isn't obvious to find because there's a add more, remove, duplicate, and an export a GIF functionalities, but there's nothing saying edit this. So I would have to know or to discover as a tester that double-clicking this, not right-clicking, but double-clicking, and on the right pace, because it's actually very peculiar on that, I get it editable. So I have a text box. How would you test this? It has the whole context around it, but we are still testing just the text box. How would you test this?
Remove the whole text in it.
So remove the whole text as the first idea. Any other ideas? Sorry? Rewrite some different text on top of it. Yeah, so you could try different texts. Yeah? Two with the same name, so kind of like seeing a little bit above one text box, that there will be many text boxes and they could have same names. Any other ideas?
I would test that some file system special characters like backslash or colon has some
So, okay, so particular characters, basically things out of the naughty strings list, but this time the backslashes and that type of semicolons and colons, making sure those would work or see if they do work. Any other suggestions? We haven't really used this much yet, but press tab or escape and see what that does. Kind of like finding functionalities around it. So escape seems to be getting us out of there. Tab seems to be taking the focus somewhere where I'm not sure where I am after that. So interesting functionalities there. Copy pasting. So there's all kinds of ideas. So we could do any of these. And all of these, right now we haven't tested anything. All of these are good ideas. But right now we also have an application. And this text field is in the context of that application. You won't know much of the application right now. But you might already start kind of like figuring out some of the things around, like there's a list of animations that it creates there, and that's the purpose of the thing. I'm going to take the first one that was suggested today, which is make it empty. What do we expect that happens when I press enter after I made it empty? Error maybe?
Yeah, information that this is not valid.
Okay, so let's see what happens. So it lets me change it. So what did we learn? So it doesn't really care about the empty space, at least in this case. Like it looks like it's still there. What would be the next test after this? What would you like to try next?
Are you still able to then double-click and open it up again?
So that's kind of a good question. So it seems like I am. I can write new text into it. What's the next test? What did we just learn? Sorry, can you say it?
Doesn't have to be full of anything, but what if there is either one space or one character?
So it doesn't have to be full, but what if there's just a little bit of something, like just one character? Let's try that one character that was suggested there, which was this. Seems to be quite okay as well. So how would you test this text field? What is the next thing? So if you think from the previous example, you went to the source. Right now you have the source, but the source is kind of big and it's going to be difficult. Is there anything like the source that you would like to see so that you would understand? How would you test this text field? Sorry? So if there's anything in help, so I can show you what the help looks like here. We have a help, it's only an about box, and it's just about this informative. So what would you do? Yeah?
Close the application and restart again.
Close the application and restart again. What do you expect to learn by that?
If the value that we have changed persists or not.
Okay, so if we try closing the application, it sounds like a good test. Good story. So it asks us if we want to save, discard, or cancel. Do you have a preference? Do you want to save this?
Now I assume that it would persist by discarding.
So based on this dialogue, I would assume that it doesn't actually persist unless we save it, because it's specifically telling me right now, the application is telling me that, you know, there's something that has been done which you can either save or, you know, let go of your changes or just decide that you will continue with the application. So what this dialogue says to me is that most likely it won't persist unless we make it persist. Would you like to make it persist? No? I'll just press cancel then. So what would be the next test? What would teach us more about this? Sorry? Right click on it. So I try right clicking on it and it doesn't do anything. You can put all kinds of things into this file. I'm going to show you a couple of things that definitely should be tested with this application. One of the things is that there's a list of things here, and when you have this empty, if you use any of the other functionalities, can you see what happens? We just had 2 items, now it looks like we have 1. Actually, we do have 2, the other one is just 1 pixel long. If we save, which is kind of what we were getting to earlier, let's give it a name that we hopefully can find from my computer. I would like to see what is the structure that it's saved in. CraftConf. This looks right. So I need to choose an application that I open it with, and something with text edit would sound like a good thing to do. So this is what it creates. It's basically an editor that saves whatever we put there, whatever we move there, whatever we write there in an XML. And when we know this about the application, we can approach the question, how would you test this text field very differently? Does it then matter that there's 2 of the same name? We didn't try it, but does it really matter when they go into different XML fields there? Does it really matter that it is empty other than the fact that it has a refresh problem? Does it really matter that it has special characters? Is there a character set defined that actually somehow limits that? So we would already have a lot more information on this application. So I just wanted to show this application as a second example of a text field that you might end up with. And what this really teaches us is this idea that we need to look at how the application is built. We need to look at what are we doing with it, and what are we doing with it might not be coming from a specification, but it might be coming from using the application and learning about it by just, you know, playing with it. Well, some call it testing it. The third example that I have is what I wanted to take in for today is the Gilded Rose. It also has a text field. Has anyone done the Gilded Rose by Emily Bach, the thing? Llewellyn has, I know, because that's where I stole it from. So let's take a look at yet another example. So we have a piece of code here. Now it is short enough to read if we feel like it. So we could read it. It's in an IDE that we can use to whatever extent we want. And we have a way of doing some tests with it. Actually, we have 2 ways. I'm just somewhere in here. We have so-called traditional assert-based tests. We could create more of them so that we can test them and run the application. We can see there's a text field right here. Any APIs actually are full of text fields. The same question comes up whenever we're testing an API. But I wanted to show you today on just another way of approaching this. So we're going to be using a thing called combination approvals, which is created by Llewellyn, who is in the back. And I can't press my right keys. So combination approvals is the idea of whatever fields we have in a method, we can create combinations of them automatically. And when we create the combinations, it creates them in a file, and we can visually look at the file and decide whether it's correct or not. So this particular function here, it has 3 inputs, so let's just get that done. It's there below, so it's the check item, so I want to just call that. And write less so that I don't make so many typos today. It seems to have 3 inputs here, so there's items that we can give to it, there's things that are called sell-ins that we can give to it, and there's something called qualities that we can give to it. I can almost write. So we can give it 3 kind of things, and I actually have a specification for that here, so I could, approach it from the specification point of view. But today, what I want to still do is I want to quick fix this a bit and get it just to a point where we can start giving these different kinds of values. So it's a string of items, and let's say the first one that we want to try out is called, let's say foo. I don't remember what my other test case said, so I'm just going to use a foo. Did I break something? My Mac is not my friend today. What did I do? Oh, here, on this one? This one, yeah, sorry. Can't see, thank you. So then on the sell-ins, that's just an integer. So just do it the same way here. A bit long text with the... If I would write less, I would make less typos. So let's say it's a 0 in the beginning, and with the last one, let's make it actually, it's also an integer, and also let's make it a 0 in the beginning. So, almost can't write. Now we have a starting point to run our tests. And for these values that I just put in, awfully small text, with the foo2, it gives me 0 and 0, or I give input 0 and 0, and it gives me back the foo2, and then -1 and 0 here. So the days, the middle one, is going kind of backwards, always by 1, by calling this method. But we have now here fields. How would you test this? What kind of things would you try? So again, we have a practical application, something real that we're testing. How would you test this? Any approaches? Conditions for the names, so you can see some values here for the names. It might be a good idea to take some of these. So let's, for example, take this one. Because I have this now in the approval tests, I can just run it again. And it generates me 2 cases, the first one that I had there already, and then one with the age brie. The name doesn't seem to be doing anything, and the same values still used seem to be staying the same. We can approve these now, so that now the test will pass. I can also run this on my setup under coverage. Does that give you new ideas on what would you test next? If you need to test this text field. Does it give you new ideas? What would you test next?
Maybe the red part of the code.
Sorry,
I mean, the green one is very checked. So
yes, so you would take the yellow one, the backstage passing?
or the red one.
Or the red one. Yeah, so there's all sorts of strings here, and we should probably take all of them. Probably running this under coverage more, we could see whatever gets covered and what not, and we could learn, with every test case, we could learn what kind of combinations actually do matter. And the real point here is just that whenever we're running these tests, we need to look at the results. That's why I kind of like this approval approach here. We need to look at the results and visually decide whether it's correct or not. The specification might come in very handy with defining that, on whether it's correct or not. There's actually, according to specification, there's plenty of problems here. Gilded rose is often used as a refactor in CADA, saying it's a production system, so actually covering it to 100% would be already enough. But I wanted to just show you this more as an example that the same ideas that we're talking about on how would you text the text field, they apply on all levels, on unit testing, on API testing, on a user interface. So we still see fields in context of use, and we need to figure out what's the right way or right values for testing that. The fourth one that I still want to show you today is a test analytics API. Has anyone ever used one of these? Okay. This is one of my favorite APIs to play with by Microsoft. It analyzes sentiments. So is something positive or negative? How would you test this? This is a text field. We can put in text. How would you test this? You know, we want to find problems, obviously. How would you test this? Try something positive. What's positive in your view? Craft is great. So just to see that it works, makes sense to start with something positive, something that kind of helpfully tells us that, you know, it seems to be at least, you know, calculating something. 96%. So not fully confident that craft is a good thing or so great. Can you come up with anything that would give me 100%? Something that is so positive that it must be giving 100%? Chocolate. Okay. Interesting idea. There was some suggestion here. Microsoft. That's going to be an interesting one. I want to really see what this does. Microsoft is kind of, you know, on the verge. What else would you test? Something positive. So the word positive. So let's see if that works. Positive. 97%. It's less than craft is great. Sorry? 3 exclamation marks. Ooh, unknown. Hadn't seen this one before. And positive. If I could write still. 97%. It's so hard to get 100. Very positive. So like try to make it even more. 97%. So apparently it's hard to find one that is 100%. But let's not try to get to 100%. Let's assume that's an area that we know that we're going to want to spend more time on later on. We know that we want to figure out what's positive enough to make it 100%. But what are the other things that we might want to test on this?
I mean, we have now the green case and the negative half.
Mm-hmm.
So we could now start, let's see, a negative sentence, like something that's bad or something like that.
Do you have a preference on negative sentences?
No.
WTF from the back row, so let's try that one. 5%. So it maybe looks like, you know, it doesn't want to say like it absolutely is negative or absolutely is positive. So it might be that actually it's very hard to find cases where it's in either one of those ends. So we're learning about the application.
Could you try sarcasm, like that's just great?
That's just great.
Yeah.
Like a description.
No, like that's just great.
So on the positive side?
It has positive words, but it's actually a negative sign.
Okay, so kind of like a, sarcastic version. That's just great, okay? So he doesn't understand sarcasm. Like we had a guy in the back who's been raising his hand. WTF, this is awesome.
Well, why are we not swearing? Why didn't you just put that in
So with all these examples, we are all the time learning on the kind of the positive versus negative. But is there any other category of test cases you could imagine?
I mean, we haven't
Yeah.
really talked about bullshit input, like numbers or emojis again, or nothing.
So things that don't have, like we tried the exclamation marks and it said no sentiment, we can't say anything. So, well, happy face. Did I have it on my list of naughty strings? Easily. This is a very positive one, right? Oh, it doesn't like copy pasting today for me. Maybe I don't want that one though. And again, we never know what's gonna come out of the API out of this. Well, emojis doesn't want to really say anything on them. So we're learning about this. But is there completely different category that you could imagine still? Different languages? I'm not going to try that one either. Anyone? More words? One word, we've tried a single word so far, yeah, so it would teach us kind of like what kind of lengths it takes.
I mean, we could try either a positive or negative sentence that is grammatically wrong.
Mm-hmm. So grammatically wrong. I'm kind of, right now fishing out of you this whole idea of what we keep hearing around AI, because this is an AI system. It's full of biases. What do you think it says about he's a programmer versus she's a programmer? What do you think it says on that? Let's try tester. Tester is 80%. Programmer is, what do you think? 50%. So, I can tell you that you can find examples around black and white, programmer, tester, and surprising combinations on whatever kinds of text you end up putting there. And probably, since it's supposedly learning as people are giving it more inputs, maybe, it gives you also different values, different days. So going back to the question of how would you test a text field? I've given you 4 examples, and basically what I wanted to show with these examples is that it really matters what the text field is about. Like you need to ask questions. You need to figure out what kind of things the test field is meant for, and you can't expect that even though you ask questions, that there will be people answering those questions. A big part of when you test an application is that actually the application is the one answering your questions. And we've seen a lot of that today with these 4 examples. You can apply all of this thinking around a text field, a number field, whatever field, on any level of testing, and it might make sense to have a discussion in the team level. What's the right place to just test all of this? My kind, the testers, have been testing with naughty strings forever. I have seriously reported thousands of bugs on web applications with just all kinds of naughty strings. That is the shallowest testing that I do as a tester, and yet it has been very fruitful. I would like to see that more of the teams would actually move to considering those ideas on the so-called lower levels of testing, and that it would then free more time for the other kinds of testing. You need to test around your assumptions. You need to always keep asking yourself, what did I learn? What did I just see? What does it show me? And it's always, you are in control. You decide what's your next question. You decide what did you learn and how many times you repeat things. And on the interfaces, there tends to be more than meets the eye. So you really need to think around how the application has been built and which ways you could go and do things. For example, for the dark function editor with the XML, it might make sense to generate all kinds of things into the file and then just visually check them instead of copy-pasting all the things from the naughty strings into that user interface. But then again, it depends on how the implementation is, and you need to be thinking around that. So that's kind of what I wanted to show today. When next time you go into a job interview and they ask you, how would you test the text field? Ask more questions. That's what QA is supposed to mean, ask questions. Thank you. Okay.